So, welcome everyone. I'm Carmen Tanner Slaughter, and we are at the Wolfer again for our author series. And tonight's guest is Morgan Jerkins. I want to tell you just a little bit about Morgan before we get into our conversation. She is the senior editor at Zora Magazine, and she's a visiting assistant professor at Columbia University. Her debut essay collection was This Will Be My Undoing. And then her second book was Wandering in Strange Lands. And both of these books, in addition to like her digital content, firmly established her as like a really prolific nonfiction writer. And so she's an acclaimed cultural critic. Her work has been featured everywhere: New York Times, The New Yorker, Esquire, Rolling Stone, Elle, The Atlantic. Like I could just continue to name publications, but just Google her and all the fabulous writing will pull up if you are not familiar with her writing. But tonight we are talking about her debut novel. She has shifted into fiction, and it is Caul Baby, and it is just one of the most fantastic books that I've read ever. Especially knowing that you're mostly known for your nonfiction, and so I want to talk about that when we get into the conversation. But it's just so lovely, and
Thank
I wanted to kind of tell you something before we even go any further.
you.
This is like a full circle moment because it was actually your review of Kathleen Collins' first collection of short stories that were published,
Mhm,
Whatever Happens to Interracial Love. I
mhm,
read that in New York Times.
mhm,
And it led me to Nina Collins, Kathleen's
mhm,
daughter. And Nina
mhm.
is the founder of the Woofer. So I
Wow!
didn't know if you
Wow!
knew that or not.
No, I didn't. I did not.
And
Wow.
so Nina is our fabulous founder, and she created this amazing platform for all of us women. And then when she and I were talking about me like starting to do some of these author interviews, you were like on my short list. I was like, A, I love your writing, but B, if it weren't for that review, I wouldn't even be here.
Hmm.
So thank you for that. So it just makes tonight
Thank
like
you.
doubly special. And thank you so
Thank
much for being
you.
with us tonight.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm so excited. Thank you for having me.
So, um, I will let you sort of explain to everyone the premise of Call Baby and the meaning of the title and a
Mm-hmm.
little bit about the book.
Mm-hmm. So I'll start off by talking about the folklore tradition from which I was writing, called baby. So in African American folklore, it's believed that if a baby is born with a call, meaning that they're born inside the amniotic sac, that they possess healing powers, protective powers. They may even have the gift of second sight, meaning that they can see in the past or see in the future. And so what I wanted to do was to dramatize that and create this family of women who are call bearers, and they sell pieces of their call, excuse me, to the highest bidder. And this is all done, to keep tradition alive, but also to maintain their foothold in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood that is Harlem, where everyone around them is being displaced and their environment is transforming. um their livelihood, or rather their rhythm of doing this enterprise, gets upended, because what happens is I start the story at a very pivotal moment. The call bearing family does not have a rightful successor really in place. And the head of the family is my mom. She's trying to figure out, like, how are we gonna go on with this, go on with our business. And what happens is they have a call bearing child brought into their home that they take as their own. What they don't realize is that this child's biological mother is a aspiring assistant DA who has a vendetta against this call bearing family for what they had done to her aunt years prior. So this is a story that weaves the trajectories, both personal and professional, of this call baby's biological family and the family that she's known since she was born. And so it's a lot of conversations, or I guess scene work and meditation surrounding not only Black motherhood and capitalism and gentrification, but also just survival and familial obligation versus independence. So that's really sort of the elements that I was working with when I created this novel.
So I wanted to just ask you because, as I said before, your nonfiction writing is so amazing and
Thank you.
it's what you're known for.
Hmm.
But I also know from reading the note in the
Hmm.
beginning of the book that fiction was actually your first love
Hmm. Hmm.
and that
Hmm.
you always wanted to be a fiction writer.
Hmm.
So, how did you decide to make the shift or to go ahead and make that leap into
Hmm.
fiction after having been so well known for nonfiction? And did you have any anxiety about it at all?
Right. A couple of things. So what I'll say is that I feel like every person has their entry point in the writing, and
Mhm.
my entry point in the writing was uh as an escape mechanism. When I was a teenager, I was bullied a lot, especially my first year in high school. And what I did as sort of a therapeutic vent was to create stories and create characters. So that's why I say that fiction was my first love, because it was a place for me to escape. And even throughout the rest of college, and even in my MFA program, I concentrated in fiction.
Yeah.
But what happened was, I'll say, is that I had my whole life planned out for me. Like, my plan when I graduated from college was that I was going to become an editorial assistant at a publishing house, or an assistant to an agent, a literary agent. And then somehow they'll discover my manuscript, and then I'll get signed, and then off to literary
Correct.
success. And that didn't happen because I graduated and I did not get any job in publishing. So I moved back home, and what I saw was that so many people who were of color and who were young, who were producing, and they were publishing at these very reputable outlets. So when I realized that that could be an option for me, I started to just pitch editors and build up my portfolio that way. So
Yeah.
when I finally got my agent, she'd known that I'd been working in fiction, and we actually tried to sell another novel and it didn't sell. But what she thought is that we should go all in with nonfiction first, because I already built up an audience and I already established relationships with editors at these various publications. So that's why we started with This Will Be My Undoing. And then once This Will Be My Undoing was picking up buzz, um, probably about a month or two before the book came out in January 2018, we had a two-book deal with Harper Collins. And the two-book deal was Wandering Strange Lands and then my fiction. And I was so thankful that they picked up my fiction, because it was a novel that I've been working on since grad school. And my advisor, and it was actually a short story at first. Caul Baby was initially a short story. And my advisor said, you should turn it into a novel. And I did. And they read the first 100 pages of it, and it was part of the two-book deal. So I was nervous about the fiction because everybody knows me for nonfiction.
Right.
I was also nervous about the fiction because, as you mentioned, like, I've been blessed to see such success in that area, that I was afraid that, like, as a writer, you can only be good at one or the other. You can't be good at both. And also the speed with which I was churning out the books. Like, I was
Mhm.
worried that because my Wandering Strange Lands was literally published last August,
Right.
that people would have assumed that I did a perfunctory job with the fiction, as if I had not been working on it off and on for 6 years. So
Right.
there definitely was a bit of anxiety surrounding its release.
Well, I will say that I love This Will Be My Undoing, but even with Wandering, you could tell in some of that writing the way that the story flowed. It was um, the writing lended itself to the fact that you love fiction because it was very descriptive. It wasn't very dry. I think you did an amazing job with that sort of melding memoir with sort of cultural commentary and
Thank you.
making us go with you through the story. So I was surprised, but then again, not surprised when I saw all the pre-pub announcements about Caul Baby. And then when I saw like the cover image and read the synopsis, I was like, oh my gosh, what in the world is she doing? I can't wait. It was like
Thank
just
you.
like sitting there, with my fingertips waiting to read it.
Thank you.
And it's it's a very seamless transit. I mean, you wouldn't if people didn't know that you were a nonfiction writer, they would assume that you had always been writing fiction.
Thank you. Yeah,
So
I mean, it's interesting that you said you're the first person that said that about wanting to change land. So I really appreciate it because I love creating portraits of people. I
mhm,
love ways in which to destroy the binary where someone isn't all the way good all the time and they're not all the way bad. And so when I created these characters in Call Baby, I always told myself it doesn't matter if I'm reading a book or I'm watching a television series or
mhm,
watching a movie. Even if I don't like a character, if I can understand the motivations behind what they did, if I can have a reader understand the motivations for why Mama is so desperate to hold on to her family in this brownstone, despite the fact that her relatives can't stand her and this brownstone is decrepit. If I can
right,
get people to understand that, then I have done my job.
yeah.
So that's something I was really intent on accomplishing.
And you did so well, and I wanted to kind of move into talking about that.
Mhm.
So, when you came up with the idea for Call
Mhm.
Baby,
Mhm.
I know I read that your first thoughts were about wanting to create a character who was gifted. And so the call was always going to be a main point in the novel.
Mhm.
But did you have a clue that you were going to sort of do this magical realism aspect?
Kind of.
Yeah.
And you know what? At the time that I created the short story, there was a magical realist aspect to it, but the whole world building surrounding the call and its properties that
Mhm,
came later.
mhm,
I had always been interested in blending reality or really elevating the surrealistic elements
mhm,
of real life, and I think part of that is inspired by the fact that when I was an undergrad, um I studied late 19th century Russian literature, which is like Dostoevsky, for example.
mhm.
And if you know anything about Dostoevsky, for anybody else who's watching, he is really bent on just submerging himself and
Yeah.
submerge himself in the psyche. Anything that has to do with the psychology of a person, and also a lot of dream sequences, really fantastic things that going on. And at the time that I was working on Caul Baby in its earliest iterations, I was reading stories like Beloved,
Mhm.
All Out Hagar's Children by Edward P. Jones, taking real life situations, but just adding an extra flair to it. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? And so I look at this book as magical realism, but it's definitely not on the same. I don't think that it's like it's too far out there. The one, because it's not my lane, but two, because it's
Mhm.
just like I don't feel like I need to do so much. And the reason why I felt that way was because we already have a legacy of the mythologizing of Black women's strength already without the call aspect of it. So when I was writing it, even when I was adding these parts about the call and its regeneration and the way it's healing people and people's pretty much lust for it, I thought, well, is that really that far fetched?
Right.
How much Black women sacrifice themselves for other people's betterment. Like, is that really far fetched? And that's what helped me to keep going through with it.
Yeah. And I mean, and it's not a secret, it's not a spoiler. Like these women are literally giving away pieces of themselves,
Yeah,
which is
yeah,
what
they're literally giving my pieces of their bodies, and that's like
they're
saying to
like.
myself, like these women are literally like graphic, but like they're cutting off pieces of their bodies,
Yeah.
and the thing about it is, it's like their gift is a blessing and a curse
Yeah.
because yeah, mm-hmm,
And I was thinking, because when I first saw the cover and the title, and of course, growing up in the South, people, they say, oh, she was born with a veil. And so it was
same thing
mainly,
here. It said born with a veil. Yep.
yeah. But it was always sort of just in my head, it was just the over kind of just like the face. And they would always say they have like the gift of sight. So the level that it is taken to in this novel was a little bit of an adjustment from sort of like what I kind of expected,
Mm-hmm,
but
mm-hmm.
it made so much sense throughout the book and with the family and what they've been doing for generations. And I loved how, as you were saying, it's not too extra with like the magical
Yeah.
elements. And sometimes people think when they say magical realism, sometimes people don't. I don't want to read that because they're thinking,
Elves and
floating,
fairies,
and
and yeah, yeah.
they get into like that fantasy, and I'm like, it's so not that. And I think, of course, we have a lot of women writers who have done it. It's like Gloria Naylor, of course, Toni
Right.
Morrison, but you don't even go that far with it. So I've been recommending it to people who have been hesitant because they're like, well, magical realism, that's not my genre. I don't read that. But I'm like, oh, no,
Right.
no, no. You'll be fine with this.
And not only that, but it's like, I personally, for me, if I hear of a black author doing magical realism, I'll be more open to it. The reason why is a couple of things. I'm already woo woo as is. I grew up,
Yeah.
I was raised Pentecostal.
Yeah.
So any talks about spirits and guardians and angels and demons and all those in between the material and the spiritual plane, you can't, there's nothing too bizarre for me.
Mm.
You know what I mean? I also just think about the fact that when I was researching Wandering in Strange Lands, when I was doing that ethnographical work in the deep south, especially the way that people talk about their ancestors, they talk about them in present tense.
Mhm.
And what that signifies to me is that, I'm gonna give a little woo woo, that when you think about black life and the continuation, or just like black life in general, there's a bit of the way we play with space and time.
Yep.
I think it's fantastic to me. And the reason why I think it's fantastic is like, just like how you opened it up with our conversation about things coming full circle. There's been so many times in my life, personally and artistically, where things will happen full circle. The example, like the cover. The
Mhm.
cover of the book is by Romare Bearden. He's a
Mhm.
famous African American painter. His mother entertained Harlem Renaissance artists. They moved to Harlem just like I did, and his mother was born in Atlantic City, like my mother.
Yeah.
The art team Harper's art team, when they recommended this artist and the cover, they didn't know that about my life. I
Right.
found that out. You know what I mean? So with certain things, even in the novel I tried to implement, like, the reason why there's two halves to the book is not only to delineate a progression of time, but also to demonstrate that it's like a call and response. Anything you hear or see in the first part of the book is going to have an echo or rippling effect to the second half.
Mhm. Yes, and I have so many notes. Like I had ended up with like 300 like highlights and like 50 notes, and I was just like, there's no way we could talk about it all. But I wanted to talk about how Harlem is also a character
Mm-hmm.
in the novel, and B, I know that it's dedicated to Black mothers. The central idea is around Black motherhood, and but then you bring in gentrification, police brutality, like all of these really heavy themes, but you do it in a way that we don't feel like we're getting hit over the head with it because it is just so much a part of everyday life. And I know
Yeah.
it's 20 years from the beginning of the novel until the conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And when you started writing, were you planning to include the gentrification aspects, or did that just kind of develop as you were writing it?
Um, Developed. So one
Mhm.
of the things that I'll say is that when you work on a novel off and on for several years, the novel's not only changing, also you're changing because
Mhm.
you're maturing. So when the novel started to take a turn, or maybe I started to take a turn maturity wise, or just in terms of my political ethos or my moral character or whatever, that's still
Mhm.
changing, right?
Yeah. Oh
But I
yeah.
think it happened in 2018. One of the things that made it change was because I had read a piece in the New York Times about Black maternal mortality rates. And one of the quotes, I'm going to paraphrase it, but it's going to stick with me for the rest of my life. But it basically said that Black maternal mortality rates are higher now than they were in 1850. 1850 was slavery, right?
Yeah.
Ever since then, that's when I was like noticing myself changing. I was like reading, looking at, like, going on Instagram. I would be under the covers at night on looking at, black mom Instagram pages, black baby Instagram
Mhm.
pages, and I would do this for hours. And I remember I finally opened up to my friend about this rabbit hole, and she was like, I think you're doing that because you're just happy to see them alive. And
Oh yeah,
that's the truth.
yeah,
I think also with regards to gentrification, like I literally I went out this past weekend with my partner, and we were just going to go out for just a nice outing because I'm introverted.
yeah,
And when we stepped out the car, I literally forgot that if you take a right, that's where I lived, because I almost didn't recognize the block anymore. And
yeah,
I lived there, 4 or 5 years prior. So for me, it was like, when I think about that, I knew that I wanted to get the street names and the landmarks because it's gonna change again, and
yeah.
some places may not be there. And I wanted to be able to immortalize the Harlem that I knew when I
Mhm.
was there. And maybe somebody will do a literary tour just by the sites that I chose
Right.
for the book. But also, I was in the final stages of revision last June, right?
Okay.
And I live in New York. I was here when the virus broke. I was here when New York was the epicenter of the virus. I was here when we were worried that we were going to run out of ICU beds. I was here for all of
Mhm.
that. And I try to tell people that, what New York experienced in March, April of 2020, it was like a post-apocalyptic silence. Imagine
Wow.
living in a place like Harlem. We have so many people of the diaspora here, and you live near the Central Park, and you don't even hear a dog bark. The only
Yeah.
noise that you hear is the sounds of blaring ambulance sirens every day. That's all you hear. So when June came around, it was an explosion of sound for a myriad of reasons. But I think the two biggest ones were the fact that people were doing social distancing in the park, and two
Mhm.
was the George Floyd protests. So rather than fighting the sound, I leaned into it. So a lot of the scenes that you brought up in your question, leading to your question that I'm answering, that was because of what I was already experiencing. And I
Yeah.
didn't want to, I'm glad that you said I didn't belabor the point, because I didn't want to, but I also wanted to know that, like, black mothers are under attack, and black children are under attack. And I really wanted to make that clear, while also honoring my audience,
Yeah.
so even though I know that I want everybody to read it, I didn't want to belabor the point, because I didn't want to re-traumatize those who know black mothers who have gone through experiences with, for example, the police like that. I didn't want to re-traumatize anybody in that way, but I did want to make it clear how surveilled people are in their own
Yes.
neighborhoods. Like there will be nights where I know black people out here congregating and the weather gets better, but I could hear the whoop whoop, right after
Right.
that, and then I don't hear anything, So that's
Yeah.
something that I leaned into the sound.
Yeah. And that's the thing. And with all the women in the book and the relationships between the mothers and the daughters. And I
Mhm.
love the fact that you were intentional about focusing on what Black mothers experience as a Black mother, as a Black daughter.
Mhm.
Like, my mother is amazing. And she's not just my mother, she's my best friend. We talk every day, sometimes many times a day. She's 5 minutes away from me. There are days where, and I can't remember exactly which character says it, but it talks about even a mother needs her mother. I'm probably not saying it exactly how you wrote it in the book, but
Oh yeah, everybody needs mothering. I remember the late DMX, rest in peace. He was on the Yala Van Zant years ago, and I remember he was breaking down crying. And I remember I was watching this episode with my mother actually, and he was saying that everybody needs to be somebody's baby.
yeah,
And when mom and before I knew what he meant, I knew I felt it, but my mom all of a sudden was like, mm-hmm. And I
yeah,
looked at it and I was like, wow. And that really meant that something to me. My mother, I'm close to my mom. I'm so close to my mom. I love my mom tremendously. You know what I mean? And I think about the sacrifices that she made. Like I tell people that, my mother was very sick with me. I think she had hyperemesis gravidarum, but I
Oh,
think she had other issues too. And the doctors actually wanted her to abort,
oh
you
my
know.
gosh.
She wanted and she didn't um because obviously I'm here, but that was what they wanted.
Yeah.
I think about my father. My father's an OBGYN. My father has made it his life's work, 40 years of work to care for Black urban women. And one of the things that he told me about a few weeks out from the publication of Caul Baby was that I have, I'll paraphrase on what he said, but he's like, I've served rich women and I've served those who are homeless and have a drug addiction. And the thing that makes it possible for both of them to remain alive, including their babies, is the community.
Oh yeah.
And that's something that I really wanted to emphasize in this book, is that even though, all skin folk and kin folk and we all have
Mm-hmm.
different political ethos, and that guides us to how we survive,
Right.
there's still a community.
Yeah.
And that's something that I just wanted to emphasize over and over and over again.
Yeah. And I mean, I know that for me, my OBGYN at the time that I was having my son was a Black woman. And he actually
Wow.
and he actually got into distress when my water broke. I could tell there was a problem. I called her immediately and she said, okay. She's like, well, you've read every book known to man about childbirth. So I believe you if you say there's a problem. And by the time we got to the hospital, the intake nurse I was telling her, I was like, there's meconium in the water, blah, blah, blah. She's like, are you a doctor?
Wow.
And I was like, no. However, this I've read everything, I had a stack of books like this. And so
Wow.
he almost died. I could have died. And I still firmly believe now, especially, that if I did not have a Black woman who I had developed a really strong relationship with, who also knew me and my thoughts and everything I had in my head about pregnancy and childbirth, one of us may not have made it. At the
Right.
time, I wasn't really that aware of like how things were for Black women, but I feel like I was just blessed and fortunate that I sought out a Black woman. And even up to the point where she's like, we have to do a C-section, you got to have epidural. And I was like,
Right.
but I have a 3-ring binder for my birth plan. And she's like,
Right, right. Like literally, I think you're the second person I told this to, second interview, but I said, like, I literally save up money now.
mm-hmm.
I save up money now so that I can afford a doula, a postpartum doula, and the best hospital suite ever.
Yeah.
And I shouldn't have to do that. But that's how afraid I am that
Oh
something
yeah.
is going to happen to me or the child that I want to carry. And not only that, but it's like I am afraid of a C-section. I feel like if they told me that I gotta have a C-section, I'll just break down and cry. And it's not just because I've been working my butt off trying to strengthen my core. The other
Mm-hmm.
part is I don't want you to put me under and I can't see what's going on.
Listen,
Like
I
I like
believe me, I am with you. I have a very low threshold for pain, but I was going to do the natural thing because it was better for the baby. But when I found out that I was going to have to do this epidural, I'm si- I'm sitting on the edge of the bed and I asked my mom, I was like, hand me the book. It's the fourth in the stack. It has the best chapter on C-sections. Let me read it real quick before they take me in. And I'm sitting on the
Jen.
bed while the guy's giving me my epidural. And I'm like, yeah, I can still feel your fingertips. You're gonna have to give me a little bit more Like I was so terrified.
Right,
But we
right,
both survived and I'm grateful that there weren't any additional complications, but it is a very, very scary thing, especially
right.
when you think you're going to have this easy breezy normal childbirth situation and then
Mm-hmm.
you wake up in the middle of the night and it's not. And again, I had a great doctor, she had a great team, and I had support from my husband and my mother. They were both in the room with me and all my family was there. But I think about so many women who don't have that, or they don't
Right.
have any, they can't if like I can advocate, I could and I did advocate for myself. But then when you have these women who can't, or if they don't have that support system, and then here you are, like obviously in a position where you are preparing for that time and still having these reservations because we know what happens to Black
Right.
women.
Right. I just know, like, if Serena Williams almost died because she had to tell the doctor, you need to check my, I think it was a white blood cell count. If they told her, you
Mm-hmm.
know, multi-millionaire, one of the best athletes ever, you know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? That, like, what would they do to the regular woman? You know,
Right.
so that's something that kind of scares me, and that's something that I wish that we didn't live in a society that would make any mother have to do that. You know what I'm
Right.
saying? So I think that that's the things that affected me, and that's why I dedicated the book to Black mothers, those of the past and those who are present and those who will be,
Yeah.
because to be able to bring Black life into a world that's bent on your destruction, um and not just your destruction, but your destruction in order to maintain a white capitalist patriarchal system.
Mhm.
It's a very bold thing. It's a
Oh
very
yeah.
bold thing to do that. So that's another thing that I was trying to emphasize too, is like Black mothers who make a decision to bring life into this world, Black mothers who decide to create families on their own terms, and what does that look like? And that's just something that I wanted to really expound upon in this book.
And you did. And see, I told you the time would fly by.
I
I wanted
know.
to get to like a few more questions before we have to end. But um the other part that I loved
Mm-hmm.
was how you did sneak in this sort of haunted house element. And
Oh yeah.
I'm trying to stay away from giving away too much because I want people to read the book and I don't
Okay.
want to spoil anything. But to
Okay.
me, that was probably the most tense, like of course the way some of the things unfolded, and wondering when they were going to find out the relationships to each other, obviously that was a heavy tension. But that house,
Oh yeah.
the way
Yeah.
you did that was exceptional. And I
Thank
just
you.
I just did,
Thank
I'm like, how long did it take? Did you just sit there and work with it
I
and
had
toy
to
with
keep
it?
it. I had to toy with it because I had a beta reader, and I'm gonna say their name, Dennis Norris II.
Mm-hmm.
And while I was revising it, they were telling me, play up more of the subtleties of a creepy house, of a creepy
Mm-hmm.
brownstone. And I'm thinking to myself, what would be creepy to me? One of the things that's creepy to me is when I look too quickly at my peripheral vision. I think I see like an apparition quickly fly past me, or like I think about shadows, and I think about certain sounds in the middle of the night. And I wanted to play that up because the way that I look at it is, and again, it's going to be into the woo woo, but it's like you can't keep tampering with fate and there not be some type of aberration in the spiritual realm. So
Yeah.
the reason why I created this decrepit brownstone that's almost having a life of its own,
Mm-hmm.
is because these women are playing with fate. They're playing with fate. And also Iris, who was like the black sheep of the family, she, unlike her other relatives, she has that second sight, where I like to say she's always busy,
Oh
like
yeah.
in her, like she's always conversing with spirits, even though other people can't see and keep ignoring her. But that's because she understands the house is on its last leg, and she knows that. That's why she's just biding her time.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, the reason why I wrote about this type of house that has a spiritual element in it, because you see that all throughout literature. You see that in Beloved, you see that in the Turner House, you see that in Loving Day by Matt Johnson. I mean, there's so many other, this type of the way the architecture influences one's idea of identity and also their
Right.
psyche. I'm so into things like that. So that's something that I wanted to emphasize, and I had to work on it, because what I try to tell people is that I am not a native of Harlem. Where I'm from a suburban, modest town in southern New Jersey. When you're in suburbia, it's monotonous,
Mm-hmm.
right? You go into a residential neighborhood, everybody's got the manicured lawns, the architecture's the same, and there's the strict delineation of space and sound. Meaning, when people have arguments, they're not sitting outside.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody is in their apart, they're in their home, right? And you have fences, gated communities, other places. So everything is very stratified. When you're in a neighborhood like Harlem, there is none of that. You know what
Right.
I'm saying? You're gonna hear a lover's quarrel at 2 a.m. in the morning, right? You're gonna hear conversations happening all of the time. But even more than that, when you are a woman, and especially a Black woman in a metropolis like New York, you have to be aware of where you
Right.
are at all times for safety. So the reason why I wanted to emphasize the landmarks, the streets, the corners, the brass on all these particularities of spaces is because I kept thinking about when I first moved here, I had to be so much more aware of the external stimuli I was interacting with for my own survival. So I
Yeah.
really wanted to be able to incorporate that in the book too.
Yeah. It was great. And like I said, the whole thing with the house, and every time as it continued to, escalate with the, especially in my mom's room, and then at the big conclusion, I was just like, well, I'm like, oh God, like can't turn the pages
And
fast
I was
enough.
hoping, I was like, I hope this conclusion feels as breathtaking as it was writing it.
Oh,
Because
it
it was
definitely.
it was great. I
Yeah.
loved it.
Yes, it really did. Even from the, at the doula center, and then just the whole
Hmm.
thing, it was, I was like watching it in my head. I could see it. I could see them, running down the street. I could see the people outside, all of it. I could see, when Helena went downstairs and there's like all of that was just, the climax was so great. And
Thank
then,
you.
you took us through that, and then of course we get the follow-up, which is so inspiring. But
Thank you.
like I said, I love the book. And I just, one more thing before we
Yes, of
go.
course, of course.
um do you, because you do write such sort of it has stressful, I would say, the things
Yeah.
that you write about, a lot, like you do some really entertaining stuff too, but the majority of what you've written nonfiction wise, is stressful. And even in this story, I know it had to be stressful to get it right, to tell this story, to
Hmm.
have that balance. So like, what do you do for your own self-care? Like, I worry so much about the writers that I love, because I'm like, you
Right.
are giving so much of yourself to your work and to your readers. So I always just kind of want to make sure that you're taking care of yourself too. So
That's really nice. I mean, here's what I'll say, and I spoke about this with another interviewer as well, is that I'm better with self care now because I make more money. And
mm-hmm,
that's unfortunate, but it's the truth. When I was touring for This Will Be My Undoing back in 2018, um, the one of the hardest parts of that book tour, and there weren't many because I was
mm-hmm.
treated very well, um, was I had young women across the country asking me how did I do self care, and I had to be honest, say I didn't. I didn't.
Yeah,
And I don't want people to be like how I was, but I didn't. For me now, I make it way more money than I did back in 2018, and even and way more than when I moved in New York in 2015. I also do therapy every week,
mm-hmm,
and I will say this: I think you know after when I was doing the research for Wine in Strange Lands, that was a lot for me to have
yeah,
to speak about all the ways Black people have been robbed. You know what
mm-hmm,
I mean? And I think I just had certain parameters for myself. For example, I won't read anything devastating when the sun goes down. That's
exactly.
one thing that I would do. But yeah, I mean, when it was pre-pandemic, I made sure that I got my nails done every other week
Mm-hmm,
because I like to look pretty, and I established a rapport with one of the nail technicians there.
yeah.
I make sure that I like to have a glass of wine. I love binge watching shows, especially crap and reality shows. So I do thank you. I am taking care of myself, and I think also because I feel more grounded in my success. And what I
Yeah,
mean by that is like when my first book came out, I was like, okay, I hit it out the park. Then I was afraid that I peaked, and I was afraid that like no one's gonna want to hear anything else I have to say, and all these sorts of things. But I think after 3 books in, I'm like, you know what? I
yeah,
think I'm gonna be okay.
yeah,
I think I'm gonna be okay. And I think if I decide to rest for a day or a week and I don't write,
yeah.
that doesn't mean that I've lost it. I've lost
No,
my mojo or whatever.
right. Well, that is a great segue into my last question,
Okay.
because you are now established as a nonfiction and a fiction writer. So, are you going to continue to alternate, or what's next? Like, your next project, is it going to be fiction, nonfiction?
It's gonna be fiction.
Okay.
And if it is nonfiction, I definitely want to make sure I have something to say.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because for me, like, so the reason why I feel so much more like I want to be experimental in fiction, I want to keep doing fiction, is because
Hmm.
reality is so much right now
Oh yes.
that a lot of things that I want to investigate, I want to create stories out of them. And I also, and I think for me, it's like I tweeted this a while ago, like a week or two ago, but it's like fiction was a way for me to escape. Now it's a way for me to bloom.
I
You
love
know,
that.
thank you.
Yeah, I
Somebody
love that.
asked, do you feel like writing fiction is a full circle moment? I said, yeah, it feels like a full circle moment, but the difference now was that I feel like I'm coming home,
Mhm.
and people are waiting for me,
Oh,
you
that's
know,
great.
and I mean in terms of readers. So I want to do more fiction. I want to create stories, and I want to write in different mediums because there's so many characters I have yet to meet, and
Yeah.
there's so many characters I have that I want to write, and I want to write and give life to,
Mhm.
rather, and I want readers to meet them too.
Well, I, for one, am going to be waiting. Very, very excited for whatever you do next. And
Thank
I
you.
really appreciate you being here tonight. It was the highlight of not the best day, but this made it all so much better. And I'm so grateful that it just worked out this way. And, that's just how life goes. So I appreciate it so much. Everybody, Caul Baby, it's out now. Get you a copy. Set aside some time to read. You're gonna want to turn those pages. I promise. It's hard to put down. It's hard to take a break from it. And thank you again, Morgan. And just whenever that next book comes out, we would love to have you back here at the Wolfer.
Thank you.
All
Thank you so
right.
much for having